What is the most important thing on your radar right now and why? I wish I had a more interesting answer for this question, but the answer for everybody has to be the US election. I have been speaking about geopolitics for over a decade now, and I usually joke, whether I'm in interviews or whether I'm doing presentations, that one of the nice things about geopolitics is I don't normally have to deal with the dumpster fire that is American politics. But you don't have a choice right now if you're doing geopolitics in the world, because the most important thing that is going to happen in the world this year that we know about is the US presidential election. And one of the reasons that is true is because usually, even when you get differences in which party the president is going to be from, US foreign policy is fairly consistent. You don't get huge hairpin changes just because a Democrat takes over from a Republican or vice versa. But that's not going to be true if Donald Trump was to win this election. We would go back to a world where the US-China trade war would get a lot more difficult if Trump won the election. It would have implications for the Russia-Ukraine war. It would have implications for US relationships with its allies, specifically the European Union and Canada, whereas the Biden administration would just be a continuation of the last couple of years. And that, of course, assumes that it's going to be a Trump-Biden runoff. That's what the polls tell us today. But everything from dark horses emerging in the race to health issues for either one of the candidates could completely change that. So I don't have the answer for what's going to happen, but the thing that we are doing internally, and that I would encourage everyone watching this to do if it affects you, is to start building scenarios. If Trump happens, what is that going to do to US-China relations and all the things that I went through? If Biden wins, what is that going to do? And do that both at the international and the domestic level. And that's the most important thing happening that we know of today geopolitically. Now, the other thing about geopolitics is that something always pops up, whether it's Russia invading Ukraine or Israel and Gaza and Palestine having a war. So you also have to be ready for the things that are unexpected, but that's the one that we know is on our radar. What is happening in the world right now that you think is not getting enough attention or consideration? For me, this is really a story about the developing world in general. And the developing world is going to become a much more important part of the story geopolitically over the next couple of years. And when I say developing world, I'm talking about countries like Brazil, Indonesia, Turkey. We have a tendency of viewing these countries through the lens of the last 30 years, where the United States was the dominant superpower, where everybody wanted globalization, everyone wanted to become a card-carrying member of the World Trade Organization, everybody was basically rowing in the same direction. And that's simply not true anymore. You have countries, not just like China, but countries like Brazil, who are trying to build a world or shape rules so that it's a little bit better for them. You have countries in emerging markets like Pakistan that maybe have bottomed out, that are facing tremendous issues, and the way that they respond to those issues could have impacts on literally billions of people with India next door. And that's before we say anything about sub-Saharan Africa, which is the only part of the world over the next 10 to 20 years where you're going to see demographic growth in populations. So if you look at a map of Africa today, and see which countries have coups or wars or insurgencies or things like that, it's a distressing number of them. And rather than talking about that and focusing on the issues that are driving that and what is that going to do to commodity prices and what does that do to geopolitical challenges, I think they're very, very standard rote stories that make it into the English language press. So I think what's not getting enough consideration is dealing with these countries on their own terms. And I think it's a challenge for anyone, whether you're in the United States or you're in China. If you're in a great power and you're looking out at the rest of the world, understanding these countries on their own terms and in terms of their own interests is what's not getting enough consideration. What do you feel is the most underappreciated risk right now? If I was asked this question last year, it would probably be the same answer. I am scared that inflation could surprise to the upside. And the reason I'm afraid of that is, we at Cognitive Investments, we have our own team that is doing financial research and all those other things. I'm the geopolitics guy. And for me, the supply side is really what is driving inflation to be a little more sticky than most projections are talking about. When you think about what central banks or the Federal Reserve are doing, they're thinking about the demand side. They're thinking about what happened in terms of COVID-19 stimulus and almost 10 years of super low interest rates and how there's too much liquidity in the system and things like that. And they think by jacking up interest rates, they're getting the economy to respond in the way that they want. But it's just one tool, and economies are a lot more complicated than that. We're sitting here today, we're recording January 16th, 2024. Oil is hanging out between $7 and $75 a barrel for Brent crude prices. Really has been hanging out there for a couple of months. I'm not sure that that is sustainable, especially if we got a large increase in demand because of disruption in the Red Sea or because we had a cold snap. I'm freezing my butt off here in New Orleans today because of that. So I'm not sure that that has been appreciated. Go back to my answer to the first question. What happens if Trump gets elected and the US-China trade war gets worse? Well, suddenly the temporary ceasefire in the trade war that we've seen between Biden and Xi would go away, and maybe goods would start costing a lot more, or companies would have to move towards reshoring in a way that they haven't really had to over the last year or two. So I think the market is way too complacent that there's been a soft landing, that inflation is coming down off the boil, that eventually we'll be getting interest rate cuts this year. I don't see that at all. I'm positioned much more for inflation probably surprising to the upside. And if anything, inflation being very volatile, something that's going to sort of ping pong back and forth rather than going in linear directions. And that's really not what the mainstream narrative is right now. What is the most interesting or valuable thing you read, listened to, or watched recently? I'll give you two. I'm currently reading King Leopold's Ghost. I'm forgetting the name of the author, but I'm sure that they will put a link in so that you can buy it on Amazon.com if you want. It's the story of the Democratic Republic of Congo and how it was conquered by not just Belgium, but really by King Leopold II, and why the Democratic Republic of Congo today is the way that it is. It's a really, really sobering story and a depressing one, but also opens your eyes up to global commodities trade and how ideology is often sort of made the handmaiden of actual geopolitical interests and the relationship between these things back and forth. And in a very different way, I guess the thing that I would recommend to watch that I watched recently, which just floored me, was Killers of the Flower Moon, the new Scorsese movie. It might be the best Scorsese movie ever. And I say that as somebody who's a Scorsese fan, but I mean, in some ways, a similar theme about how what the American relationship is with Native Americans and how oil got tied up in that. And it's also just a really tremendous performance. If you're looking for something that's a little more entertaining, I would also say I'm late to the party here, but I just discovered Slow Horses on Apple TV. I could watch Gary Oldman play that character all day long. And if you haven't seen Slow Horses like me, I've already burned through the 3 seasons over the last 2 weeks, but it's a great show, and does have relevance to the world and intelligence and security issues and all these other things. What is on the horizon that you're looking forward to? I'm actually a tremendously optimistic person, and geopolitics today doesn't allow a lot of space for optimism because we have to talk about risk and war and all the terrible things that are happening in the world. But no matter whether you see me on podcasts or interviews or presentations or things like that, I'm actually tremendously optimistic. We're going through a global energy transition right now. Just look at how much renewable energy capacity has come online in the last year. Just look at the scientific advances that we're making in everything from mining technology to battery technology and things like that. I think we're living through a pretty incredible time in terms of energy innovation. The same is true of biotech. And I don't want to get into COVID-19, politics and vaccine diplomacy and things like that. But some of the things that are happening with biotechnology and the research that we're doing with everything from animal vaccines to human vaccines to cancer treatments, right up into, seed technology and creating tropical varieties of wheat that can grow in tropical environments. There's a lot of really interesting things happening in the biotech space. And as both an investor and as somebody who is optimistic about the world, I'm really curious to see how some of these things are going to change life. Think about where the world was 30 years ago versus where it'll be in 30 years. I'm expecting that kind of stepwise change. And then how can people follow updates from you? That's pretty easy. You can go to our website, cognitive.investments. All these links will be there, but I have my own podcast. It's called Cognitive Dissidents. I'm on Twitter, or X, I guess I should say, at Jacob Shap. And then you can always, if any of that is too confusing, just email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. I'm happy to hook you up. So those are the ways to get to me.